In 2008, the global supply chain of subprime debt finally collapsed as a ripple effect of debtors, whom no one reasonably expected to pay their mortgages, defaulted en masse. Something bizarre happened in the response to it. The banks and their trading partners did not accept that their frenzy of debt speculation, or of betting on subprime mortgages that may or may not have defaulted, would have actually had risk. Whilst they were happy to accept the rewards of a booming market, which returned lots of interest, when the winning streak came to an end, they turned to their governments and their taxpayers, and they demanded to have their losses covered at any cost. What was the justification for this? That the established economic order, the way of doing things, must continue. In Europe, the crisis served as a catalyst to reboot the old project of neoliberalism, which is one of gutting and discarding the institutions of the welfare state, that is, public services in their open spaces, legal protections for workers, and financial and social safety nets for the vulnerable. The gap in wealth between the propertied class and the classes of labour widened at an even faster pace, and yet this insistence of the capitalist class on the status quo has bred resentment for it. Here we are, a decade later, and the unquestionable faith in global capitalism that dominated the 90s and noughties has all but gone. Liberals and conservatives alike are on the defensive, extolling the virtues of capitalism in the face of constant criticism from the disenfranchised, a task at least in the West that was unimaginable before the global financial crisis. There is now an earnest curiosity about alternative ways of organising the world, and there is no shortage of options for the young ideologues to pursue. It is the aim of this short video to briefly detail a history of capitalism by describing its critics. To that end, we'll briefly discuss and clarify socialism, Marxism, communism, and anarchism. The first sparks of thinking towards what we now call socialist theory most likely started with a French revolutionary by the name of François-Noël Babeuf. Born in 1760, Babeuf worked as a tax collector in rural Picardy, enforcing what he saw as an unjust legal and financial arrangement which impoverished local peasants to the benefit of their feudal lords. Babeuf eventually travelled to Paris to campaign for the abolition of feudal taxes, as well as to begin a career in journalism. Shortly after this, the revolutionary government took hold of France, and Babeuf took on minor roles in its administration. In 1794, after the execution of the revolutionary leader Robespierre, a reactionary force now called the White Terror had taken control of France, and Babeuf became its fierce opponent. During this time, Babeuf started up a newspaper called The Tribune of the People, which espoused radical ideas such as a progressive tax, the redistribution of wealth, and the abolition of class and slavery, and the emancipation of women. He also called for a restoration of the Constitution of 1793, which he believed to be more democratic and egalitarian than the Constitution of 94, which was enforced by the White Terror. Eventually, he began to conspire a violent overthrow of the reactionary government with the goal of placing an even more left-wing one in its place. It was the rise in popularity of Babeuf's social and economic analysis, as well as his insurrectionary aims, that would lead to his execution on May the 27th, 1797. It was 20 years later, in 1817, that a socialist theory started development in Europe, with the publication of a book by the simple name of Industry by another Frenchman, Henri de Saint-Simon. Saint-Simon's ideology, industrialism, emphasized the economic concerns of what he called the working class, those engaged in productive labour. He was also the first thinker to profess the potential of the scientific method and planned intervention in the development of society, which he believed went through stages of development. As well as laying the groundwork for socialists to follow shortly after him, this faith in human rationality as the guiding principle in human development was the precursor for modern humanism. This spirit of utopian society would be continued by Charles Fourier, whose most lasting contribution to anti-capitalist theory is that of attractive labour, a principle of dividing labour in a way that was spontaneous, dignified, and voluntary, and compensated labourers not as hired workers receiving a wage, but as cooperative partners who shared the dividends of their joint efforts. He also advocated for the participation of women in any field of work in which they were found capable, as well as the free expression of same-sex attraction and gender non-conformity, which he labelled androgyny. He is also credited with coining the word feminism. Fourier sought to liberate men and women so they could fulfill their intellectual, emotional, and even sexual capacity. Around the time of Fourier's death in 1837, another social critic came to prominence in France, Pierre Leroux. Leroux was the first to use the word socialism in such a context that we're used to now, and brought it into popular discussion at the time. He was also heavily involved in popularizing the theories of Saint-Simon, until he eventually came to his own version of socialism, stressing democracy and a holistic account of the needs of humans. His political activism would lead to him being exiled by Napoleon III in 1851. Outside of France, an important socialist figure was that of Robert Owen. Owen was a British industrialist who ran a textile mill in Lancashire, Scotland, which was famous for its social and industrial protections for workers, inside and outside the factory. In 1813, Owen published his collection of essays, A New View of Society, which stressed the role of environment on the formation of a person's character. Naturally, Owen placed great emphasis on education and early intervention. Eventually, he had come to see the reform of capitalist system as insufficient and proposed new ideas of workshops owned by its workers, as well as communities of collective workshops, formed in a federation to each other. In 1825, he had raised funds to move to America and purchased a plot of land which he had called New Harmony, which was to be used as an execution of his ideal society. The project was ultimately a failure, and Owen returned to Britain, although it did inspire similar communities across Britain and Ireland. In the 1830s, when the labour movement had started to gain momentum across Europe, he had become heavily involved in the trade union movement and set up a labour exchange for the mutual benefit of workers, as well as the Grand National Consolidated Trade Union, meant to unite all labourers into a single coherent political body. Eventually, facing opposition from employers and landowners, and imprisonment and physical violence from the British government, membership of the trade union dwindled. Today, Owen's lasting legacy is in the form of the cooperative movement. Owen's influential ideas of worker-owned factories would go on to inspire the French labour reformist Louis Blanc, who coined the maxim, from each according to their ability, and to each according to their needs. His notion of a communal society also had a major impact on Etienne Cabet, the French writer famous for his utopian novel, Voyage to Icaria, and inventor of the word communism. Now that we have briefly examined the origins of some of the most important ideas of socialism, in the next video we will look at the socialist tendency in the mid to late 1800s, when it gained a violent and revolutionary streak under the influence of Louis-Auguste Blanqui, as well as three of the most prominent thinkers in anti-capitalist theory: Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, Karl Marx, and Peter Kropotkin.